As always, your very valuable insight. We move on now. Russia claims it's holding fire, but Ukraine says the guns never stopped. The Kremlin says its forces are observing a 3-day unilateral ceasefire ordered by President Vladimir Putin. The truce was meant to align with Victory Day celebrations in Moscow, but Ukraine says it's nothing but a farce. Kiev reports 734 ceasefire violations and over 60 Russian assault operations, all just hours into the so-called truce. Ukraine never agreed to the ceasefire. It says Russian forces are attacking across the entire front line, including guided bomb strikes in the northern Sumy region. Russia, meanwhile, accuses Ukraine of breaking the truce, first saying its troops are only responding to continued hostilities. Ukraine says it will keep its allies informed as fighting shows no sign of slowing down despite the Kremlin's claims. Joshua Barnes joins us once again to discuss this further. Joshua, we have seen a temporary ceasefire enacted on Easter Sunday prior to this one. We get into the first few hours of Vladimir Putin's imposed VE-Day ceasefire, with multiple reports of a violation on both sides. What updates have you got for us in regards to this ceasefire?
Yes, well, Thomas, this unagreed ceasefire, that must be clarified. This ceasefire that was proposed by Vladimir Putin and has not been agreed for by Ukraine started on Thursday morning. Now, the general consensus in Ukraine is that it is quieter. Drone strikes have not been reported, where previously there have been areas heavily struck by drones and missiles. That hasn't been the case. Military front lines are also noticeably quieter. However, Ukraine have, of course, alleged that there were earlier violations, Russia, of course, doing the same. But it's imperative that we look at this as what it is, and that is Russia has proposed this ceasefire. They've called this because of Putin and Russia's VE Day, Victory Day celebration taking place on the 9th of May. This has never been agreed to by Ukraine, but serious measures have been put in place by Russia to make sure that world leaders are safe. Of course, there are dozens of world leaders who are taking part in this celebration. President Xi, who you've mentioned, is already there. Lula da Silva from Brazil, Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela, just some of the world leaders who will be present. So Putin's gamble here is that Ukraine comply as much as possible to make sure that no world leaders are put at risk. Russia has clarified they will do what they can to ensure the safety of these dignitaries, but haven't been able to guarantee it because Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, hasn't categorically agreed to this 3-day ceasefire. His rhetoric has remained the same. A 3-day ceasefire is not enough. We are working towards a 30-day ceasefire with Russia, something that the United States have also persistently spoken about. Now, there's hope amongst mediators, including the United States, that if this 3-day ceasefire is followed, there's scope for a longer lasting agreement, even if it is just a month. But as it stands, despite the minor violations that both sides have reported, the general consensus in Eastern Europe is that this is generally holding. We will, of course, be across all of those updates, bringing you any of the latest developments from Russia and Ukraine.
Joshua, Donald Trump's rhetoric is the fact that a peace deal is still on the table. However, given the circumstances of Volodymyr Zelensky rejecting this ceasefire and reports of violations on both sides, what does that say about the current negotiations? We've obviously seen requests from the United States for Ukraine and Russia to negotiate directly. That also hasn't happened yet. What can you say about the current relations between and the diplomatic efforts between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, yes, Tom, I wish I had more information than what we've been reporting in recent days, weeks and months. But currently there is a complete impasse between Russia and Ukraine. Putin has spoken about direct discussions with Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky says until a ceasefire, no direct negotiations will take place. Vladimir Putin proposing this 3-day ceasefire. Volodymyr Zelensky saying we only want a 30-day ceasefire. The positions are more unparalleled, unaligned, when it comes to these demands. Of course, the United States have been clear, saying that potentially Ukraine needs to give back Crimea to Russia. Of course, Russia has taken Crimea in 2014. But this is something that Volodymyr Zelensky is not wanting to do. He says that all Ukrainian territory, around 20% of it, which has been taken by Russia, needs to be returned to Ukraine as part of any ceasefire deal. The US is doing what they can. They've signed a recent minerals deal with Ukraine, but this comes after frosty relations between Trump and Zelensky, and we know that Donald Trump has been more open to discussions with Russia, in contrast to Joe Biden's administration. The European allies are still, of course, playing their part in trying to hold talks, and Ukrainian allies are regularly meeting on at least a semi-regular basis, but the situation remains at somewhat of a standstill. The US rhetoric as a deal could come soon, but the US have also spoken about withdrawing themselves from these negotiations. Donald Trump's flip-flopping at play once again in this instance. I think it's one of those where negotiations are probably happening on the sidelines. We hear of meetings like Witkoff and Putin, and also like the Saudi meetings between US diplomats and Ukrainian and Russian officials. But as it stands, we're waiting with bated breath to see if there are any further key violations in this 3-day unagreed ceasefire.
Joshua Barnes, thank you very much for joining us. We now move over to the United States, where at least 80 Columbia students have been arrested by police. They had been seized part of the school's main library on Wednesday in the biggest pro-Palestinian demonstration on campus since last year's wave of protests against Israel's war in Gaza. Their hands had been cuffed with plastic zip ties, and they could be seen being loaded into New York Police Department vans and buses outside Butler Library as the NYPD officers swept through the 6-story building to round up other protesters who refused to leave. Reportedly, police arrived on campus in force at the request of Columbia officials, who had said the student demonstrators were occupying the library's second-floor main reading room, were engaged in trespassing.